Welcome back. This is the second clip in some of the concepts that I wanted to pass your way, trying to make sense of some of these ideas that show up in our textbook. And this one is, in my opinion, one of the critical ones that we seem to, as a society, be losing some sense of how this one works. And I'm not sure all the reasons why that is, but I think it's important that we get a sense of what a market failure is. Let me give you an example, sort of different from what's showing up on the board and what's showing up in your textbook first. When you look at the free market system is great. It delivers the goods. It delivers the goods at a very reasonable price, quality, all of those things, the connections between supply and demand, you and I as customers, business trying to figure out how to connect up to us. In many cases, that system works really well. It doesn't work really well for everything. So, for example, a dam. A dam is a very expensive project. It costs a pile of money to build the dam, and when is the return on investment? And typically when we talk about a dam or other major infrastructure projects, the return on investment may be 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road before we actually recoup those costs. What does Wall Street want? Wall Street wants their return on investment when? If not now, certainly tomorrow, if not yesterday. And so the free market system typically is not good at certain kinds of activities just because of the nature of how the funding process works and how you structure the connection to stockholders and all the other players that are part of the deal. So let's walk through these real quick. So the first one that our textbook talks about is something called lack of competition. And one of the issues with lack of competition is that in a free market system, sometimes you'll have one company, we'll get into this later in the course when we get into monopolies and oligopolies and the structure of our economic system in the society, but sometimes you will have a situation where a company is so dominant that they can essentially establish the rules of the game. So they can set price without any regard to supply and demand. They can ignore quality, they can ignore customer service, they can ignore innovation, and the answer is, in the long run, free market system probably will solve that too, but how long do we really want to wait on that? And so lack of competition, monopoly, typically is an important issue that the government sometimes has a role to play. Now, let's be fair, how much has our government been doing about this one lately? Not a heck of a lot, but they're still there and they still play some role with that. Externalities is the second one. Externalities is another important question. And typically you'll see, particularly when you get to the environmental chapter, that one of the consequences of externalities is that the basic definition is that somebody does something and somebody else has to pay the consequences, which hardly seems fair. And there's actually lots of examples of this. If any of you are interested, there's something called moral hazard, which in some ways is at the heart of the Great Recession, that you had some players that were making a pile of money and passing the risk to somebody else, and the person who assumed the risk had no idea that they were assuming that level of risk. And so there's issues with externalities. So classic example of this, and we see this all over the place. Last year, 2 years ago, West Virginia had a situation where some company had a tank leak or burst or whatever, and all of a sudden the river is contaminated. Well, upriver, what are the consequences? No consequences upriver. What are the consequences downriver? People were turning on their faucets and what was coming out was sludge. They could not use their water. They could not, all the way around. It was awful. And so the problem is that with an externality, somebody else has to bear the consequences of somebody else's decision. Now let's give you another local example. Okay? Grand Rapids, for example, has ozone action days regularly in the summer. Okay? Ozone action day means that they've got too much air pollution. Grand Rapids is about as clean a city as you can find. So where's all this air pollution coming from? Well, surprisingly enough, the wind blows from the west. which means all of the air pollution created in Chicago sort of lands to some degree on Grand Rapids. You know, we could go back historically and we could talk about acid rain, other examples of the same phenomena. So exactly what is Grand Rapids supposed to do about Chicago's pollution that they're bearing the brunt of? And the answer is, if you don't have a framework of externalities, then you don't have a way to, in fact, deal with the problem. So, I mean, for me, there's a reason we have an EPA, because there are certain environmental issues that cross boundaries that are not easy to solve. It's not as if Grand Rapids can mount up their militia and go to Chicago and say, stop doing this stuff. I mean, it's just not the way it works. So externality is a very important notion, and you should be well aware of how this plays out in many arenas, because it can happen in finance, it can happen in environment, it can happen between countries, it can happen all over the place in all sorts of ways. Public goods is the third category. And so typically the free market system doesn't place a value on green space. Well, I don't know about you, but I like my green space. And so typically when you look at public goods, there are certain things that are done that benefit everybody in some real sense. And the free market system by itself is not likely to be able to handle that kind of a framework. And so that's why obviously you need a government to step in and do certain kinds of things. Fourth category is inequality. And so one of the issues that we're certainly seeing in our society is the shrinking of the middle class in rather dramatic ways in the last 25 years. Middle class, we'll get into this later in the course, but middle class was a phenomenon, the first society in the history of the world that had a middle class that was the dominant class was the late 40s, early 50s in America. And so we watched the rise of the middle class in the last 65 years, basically, sort of emerge, and then it seems to be diminishing to some large extent. So the question is, what happens to a capitalist system if the middle class sort of goes away to some extent? Well, one of the notions of the capitalist system is you and I have to be consumers, and we have to be able to purchase the kinds of goods that are being produced. And if we don't have the kind of income, and only a handful of people at the top have enough income, a capitalist system is going to crumble at some level. So there are always issues of inequality that show up. And again, one of the questions that shows up here is anytime you start to mess with this one, you're going to have some people that win, and you're going to have some people that lose. And so we ought to have an intelligent discussion about winners and losers as we try to address the question. There are also something that, I've talked about this in other places, but this is more the progressives would focus more on this. The conservatives would focus more on the question of mobility. So mobility actually means a couple things. One is you and I being able to move up or down the economic scale, or the second way that we normally talk about it is generationally moving up or down. And that flexibility has to be built in. Well, one of the things we've seen in America is not only has inequality been growing, but mobility has been going down. And so it's a real issue for us to address in our course. So you've got the four basic categories. There are other categories out there beyond these four, but those are the basic ones. I also wanted to mention real quick, we've got something called the government failure. So sometimes when the government steps in to try and address some problem, whatever, what do they sometimes do? They create a worse problem than they were trying to fix. And that, in fact, can happen. One of the reasons that I frame it this way is that you go back to the 1950s, and there was an assumption, 50s, 60s, an assumption in our country that the government was a positive force that was moving society towards better goals. That is very different than the way we tend to see government today. We tend in many ways to see the government as the enemy, and the government is creating these failures every which way. And we don't understand why we have to spend our taxes, send them to Washington. We don't see the benefit of all of that. Well, the answer is our society has changed, and our understanding of this system has changed pretty dramatically. So understanding Market failures is a good thing. Understanding when government failure can show up is also a good